The circumstances were very similar. I believe that.
After 28 years of silence, John Ramsey just revealed something that changes everything we thought we knew about his daughter's murder. What he told investigators this year has left the world absolutely stunned, and by the end of this video, you'll understand why this revelation might finally solve one of America's most haunting mysteries. But before we get to that earth-shattering confession, we need to go back to Christmas Day, 1996, when 6-year-old JonBenet Ramsey was living what would be her final day on Earth. If you're ready to uncover the truth that's been hidden for nearly 3 decades, hit that subscribe button now, because this story will take you to places you never expected. The snow fell gently outside the Ramsey home in Boulder, Colorado, as Christmas Day 1996 unfolded like any other holiday morning. JonBenet Ramsey, a successful businessman whose company Access Graphics had just become a billion-dollar subsidiary of Lockheed Martin, watched his daughter JonBenet unwrap her presents with the pure joy that only a 6-year-old could possess. John had built what seemed like the perfect life. After serving in the U.S. Navy and earning degrees in electrical engineering and an MBA, he'd married Patsy in 1980, and together they created a family that looked like it belonged in a magazine. JonBenet, with her blonde curls and bright smile, had just received a new bicycle that Christmas morning. 9-year-old Burke was excited about his own gifts, and the house buzzed with the warm chaos of family celebration. But beneath the surface of this picture-perfect Christmas, something was terribly wrong. John would later tell investigators that he noticed something different about JonBenet that day, something that he couldn't quite put his finger on. She seemed quieter than usual, almost distant, as if she was carrying a secret too heavy for her small shoulders. As evening approached, the family settled into their post-Christmas routine. John lifted JonBenet, who had grown tired from the day's excitement, and carried her to bed. It was a tender moment between father and daughter, one that would haunt him for the rest of his life, because he had no idea it would be the last time he would ever hold his little girl alive. The house grew quiet as the Ramsey family prepared for what should have been a joyful trip to Michigan the next day to visit John's older children from his first marriage. Everything was packed, plans were made, and the family went to sleep with the contentment that comes after a perfect Christmas day. But what John discovered the next morning would destroy everything he thought he knew about his own family and launch one of the most controversial murder investigations in American history. The alarm clock read 5:30 a.m. when Patsy Ramsey's eyes snapped open on December 26, 1996. She had always been an early riser, but this morning felt different. There was a heaviness in the air, a sense that something was fundamentally wrong, though she couldn't yet understand what. Patsy made her way down the spiral staircase of their Tudor-style home, her footsteps echoing in the pre-dawn silence. The plan was simple. Get ready for their 7 a.m. flight to Michigan, where they would continue their Christmas celebration with John's older children. But as she reached the bottom of the stairs, her eyes fell on something that would change everything. There, spread across 3 pages of her own household stationery, was a handwritten note that would become one of the most analyzed pieces of evidence in criminal history. Patsy's hands trembled as she read the opening lines. "Mr. Ramsey, listen carefully. We have your daughter." The ransom note was unlike anything investigators had ever seen. It was theatrical, almost movie-like in its language, demanding exactly $118,000 for JonBenet's return. What made this amount so chilling was that it matched John's recent Christmas bonus down to the dollar, a detail that only someone very close to the family would know. But here's where the story takes its first dark turn. When investigators later analyzed that 911 call, they discovered something that Patsy couldn't have known at the time. Enhanced audio technology would reveal background voices that shouldn't have been there, including what sounded like Burke's voice, despite claims that he had slept through the entire ordeal. At 5:52 a.m., exactly 22 minutes after finding the note, Patsy called 911. But listen carefully to how she reported her daughter's disappearance. "We have a kidnapping. Hurry, please." Notice the detached language, the use of we instead of I, and how she mentioned the ransom note before even saying her daughter was missing. The 911 operator stayed on the line, but what happened next would puzzle investigators for decades. The call seemed to end, but the phone wasn't hung up properly. In those final moments, enhanced audio allegedly captured 3 distinct voices. John saying, "We're not speaking to you." Patsy asking, "What did you do?" "Help me, Jesus." And most shocking of all, Burke's voice saying, "What did you find?" This was impossible. Burke was supposed to be asleep upstairs, unaware that his sister was missing. Yet there he was, apparently awake and involved in a conversation that his parents would later claim never happened. When police arrived at the Ramsey home at 6 a.m., they found a family in apparent distress. John was pacing, Patsy was crying, and Burke was nowhere to be seen. The first responding officers made what would later be called catastrophic errors in judgment. Instead of treating the house as a crime scene, they treated it as a kidnapping case, allowing friends and family to come and go freely. The ransom note had said the kidnappers would call between 8 and 10 a.m., but that call never came. As the morning stretched on, the house filled with friends, pastors, and victim advocates. Evidence was trampled, fingerprints were obscured, and crucial clues were lost forever. But hidden in that 911 call was something that would haunt investigators for decades, something that suggested this wasn't what it seemed, and pointed to a truth so disturbing that it would divide public opinion for nearly 30 years. By 10 a.m. on December 26th, the Ramsey house had become a chaos of well-meaning friends and family, but what should have been a secure crime scene was now hopelessly contaminated. Detective Linda Arnn arrived to find a situation that violated every protocol she'd ever learned about kidnapping cases. The ransom note had been handled by multiple people, moved from its original location, and photographed only after crucial evidence had already been disturbed. John's behavior during these morning hours would later be scrutinized by investigators and amateur sleuths alike because his actions seemed inconsistent with those of a desperate father whose daughter had just been kidnapped. While Patsy sobbed in the arms of friends, John appeared remarkably composed. He spent time on the phone arranging business matters, he organized his mail, and he even discussed travel plans with friends. But most puzzling of all was his unexplained absence from the house for approximately 90 minutes during the crucial morning hours. When investigators later asked John where he'd gone, he claimed he'd left to get the mail from their mailbox. But here's the problem. The Ramsey house had a mail slot in the front door. There was no need to leave the house to retrieve mail, especially not for 90 minutes during the most critical time in a kidnapping case. Where John went during those missing 90 minutes remains one of the most troubling mysteries of the case. Some investigators believe he used this time to dispose of evidence or coordinate with potential accomplices. Others suggest he was simply trying to escape the chaos of the house and think clearly about the situation. But the most damning evidence of all was what wasn't happening in the house. Despite the ransom note's specific instructions not to call police, the house was crawling with law enforcement. Despite the kidnappers' threats to monitor the family's actions, John and Patsy seemed remarkably unconcerned about potentially endangering their daughter's life. As the day wore on, Detective Arnn became increasingly uncomfortable with the scene. She'd handled dozens of kidnapping cases, but nothing about the Ramsey house felt right. The family's behavior was odd, the crime scene was compromised, and most troubling of all, crucial areas of the house hadn't been thoroughly searched. The basement, in particular, remained largely unexplored. Initial responding officers had done a cursory sweep, but they'd failed to check the wine cellar, a small room tucked away in the basement's farthest corner. This wasn't just an oversight, it was a failure that would haunt the Boulder Police Department for decades. By 1 p.m., with no word from the supposed kidnappers and no new leads to follow, Detective Arnn made a decision that would either solve the case or destroy it forever. She instructed John and his friend Fleet White to conduct a thorough search of the house, focusing on areas that might have been missed. John's reaction to this request was immediate and decisive. While Fleet White headed upstairs to search the upper floors, John went directly to the basement, moving with a purpose that seemed to suggest he knew exactly where he was going. And then, at 1 p.m., John made a decision that would either save his family or damn them forever. He walked straight to the wine cellar, a room that had been locked and overlooked by police, and what he found there would change everything they thought they knew about JonBenét's disappearance. The discovery. The basement of the Ramsey home was a maze of storage rooms, utility areas, and recreational spaces. But tucked away in the farthest corner was a small room that the family called the wine cellar, though it was primarily used for storage. This room had a wooden door with a latch, and it had been locked when police first arrived. John Ramsey approached that door with Fleet White following close behind. According to John's later testimony, he unlatched the door and immediately saw something that made his blood run cold. There, in the corner of the small room, was a white blanket covering what appeared to be a small body. What happened next would be debated by investigators for decades. John immediately pulled away the blanket, revealing JonBenét's body. Her mouth was covered with duct tape, and around her neck was a crude garrote made from a broken paintbrush handle and white cord. Without waiting for police or preserving the crime scene, John removed the duct tape from his daughter's mouth and picked up her body. Fleet White, who witnessed this discovery, later described John's behavior as strange and concerning. Instead of immediately calling for police or medical assistance, John seemed to be examining the body, almost as if he was looking for something specific. When John finally carried JonBenet upstairs, he placed her on the living room floor and covered her with a jacket. Detective Linda Arndt, who was the only law enforcement officer present at the time, found herself in an impossible situation. She was alone in a house with multiple potential suspects, a compromised crime scene, and a dead child whose body had just been moved and contaminated by her own father. But what Arndt observed in those crucial moments would become some of the most damning evidence against John Ramsey. She later testified that John's behavior upon finding the body was unlike anything she'd ever seen from a grieving parent. He seemed more concerned with controlling the scene than with mourning his daughter. The timing of the discovery was also suspicious. John had gone directly to the wine cellar, almost as if he knew JonBenet would be there. He'd bypassed several other rooms and storage areas, moving with a purpose that suggested prior knowledge of the body's location. Even more troubling was what John did immediately after finding JonBenet. Within 20 minutes of discovering his daughter's body, he was on the phone with his pilot, arranging a flight to Atlanta for what he claimed was a crucial business meeting. When Detective Arndt questioned this decision, John insisted that he needed to get his family away from Boulder immediately. The crime scene was now hopelessly contaminated. JonBenét's body had been moved, the duct tape had been removed, and crucial evidence had been lost forever. But what the medical examiner would discover during the autopsy would reveal a truth so disturbing that it would point to a level of violence and premeditation that went far beyond a simple kidnapping gone wrong. The initial examination revealed that JonBenet had died from strangulation, but the garrote around her neck was no simple murder weapon. It was a sophisticated device that required knowledge and time to construct. The paintbrush handle had been broken from a brush belonging to Patsy's art supplies, and the cord had been carefully tied in a way that suggested the killer had experience with such devices. But what the autopsy revealed would point to a truth so disturbing that it would tear apart everything investigators thought they knew about this seemingly perfect family and launch one of the most controversial murder investigations in American history. The evidence speaks. The autopsy of JonBenet Ramsey revealed a crime so brutal and calculated that it defied the initial theory of a kidnapping gone wrong. Dr. John Meyer, the Boulder County coroner, found that the 6-year-old had died from strangulation caused by the garrote, but she had also suffered a devastating skull fracture that would have been fatal on its own. The garrote itself was a sophisticated torture device, crafted with precision from Patsy's own paintbrush and white cord. This wasn't a weapon of opportunity. It was a carefully constructed instrument that required time, knowledge, and a level of cruelty that suggested the killer had a personal connection to the victim. But the most shocking discovery came from the sexual assault evidence. The medical examiner found clear signs that JonBenet had been violated, both on the night of her death and potentially on previous occasions. This revelation transformed the case from a kidnapping to something far more sinister, a child sexual abuse case that had escalated to murder. The ransom note, which had initially seemed like evidence of an outside kidnapper, now appeared in a completely different light. Handwriting experts who analyzed the 3-page letter found it to be one of the longest ransom notes in criminal history, filled with movie quotes and theatrical language that suggested it was written by someone trying to misdirect the investigation. The paper came from Patsy's own notepad, and the pen used to write it was found in the house. Most telling of all, the amount demanded, $118,000, matched John's recent Christmas bonus exactly. This wasn't information that would be available to a random kidnapper. It was insider knowledge that pointed to someone very close to the family. Handwriting analysis couldn't definitively identify the author, but experts ruled out both John and 9-year-old Burke. However, they couldn't rule out Patsy, whose handwriting showed similarities to the note in several key areas. The letter also contained what appeared to be practice starts, suggesting the author had made several attempts before settling on the final version. But the most compelling evidence was yet to come. During the detailed forensic examination, investigators discovered something that would eventually exonerate the entire Ramsey family: unidentified male DNA. This DNA was found in multiple locations: on JonBenét's underwear, on her leggings, under her fingernails, and even on the garrote itself. The genetic material belonged to an unknown male who was not related to the Ramsey family and had no legitimate reason to be in contact with JonBenet. Additional physical evidence supported the theory of an intruder. There was a broken window in the basement, a suitcase positioned beneath it as if someone had used it to climb out, an unidentified boot print in the basement, and a Caucasian pubic hair found on the blanket that covered JonBenét's body. But perhaps the most puzzling piece of evidence was found in JonBenét's stomach during the autopsy: undigested pineapple. This created a significant problem for investigators because both John and Patsy insisted that JonBenet had not eaten anything after dinner on Christmas Day, and they had put her to bed immediately after returning from a Christmas party. The pineapple evidence suggested that JonBenet had been awake and eating sometime after her parents claimed she was asleep. A bowl of pineapple was found on the kitchen table with Burke's fingerprints on it, suggesting that he had been eating the fruit sometime during the night. This evidence painted a picture of a family whose timeline didn't match the physical evidence, and whose behavior on the morning of December 26th was inconsistent with parents who had just discovered their daughter was missing. Yet despite all this evidence, John's own actions that day would make him the prime suspect in his daughter's murder, and the media circus that followed would destroy his reputation and tear apart his family in ways that he could never have imagined. In the weeks following JonBenét's murder, John Ramsey found himself at the center of a media firestorm that would consume his life for decades. Every action he had taken on December 26th was scrutinized, analyzed, and interpreted in the worst possible light by investigators who had already decided he was guilty. The flight to Atlanta that John had arranged within 20 minutes of finding his daughter's body became a focal point of suspicion. When questioned about this decision, John claimed he needed to get his family away from the media attention and that he had an important business meeting. But investigators saw this as an attempt to flee the jurisdiction and avoid questioning. John's behavior during the police interviews was equally troubling to investigators. He seemed detached, almost clinical in his responses, showing what they perceived as a lack of appropriate emotional response to his daughter's death. When asked about his activities on Christmas Day, John's answers were inconsistent and contradictory. He initially claimed that he had read to JonBenet before putting her to bed, but later changed his story and said he hadn't read to her at all. He claimed that he had been asleep all night, but couldn't explain his 90-minute absence from the house on the morning of December 26th. Most damning of all was John's claim that he had found a basement window broken and open when he searched the house, but he had failed to mention this crucial detail to investigators initially. When pressed about this omission, John couldn't provide a satisfactory explanation for why he hadn't immediately reported a potential point of entry for an intruder. The contradictions in John's statements led investigators to develop a theory that would haunt him for years: that John Ramsey had been sexually abusing his daughter and had killed her to cover up his crimes. This theory suggested that Patsy had discovered the abuse and helped cover it up by writing the ransom note and staging the kidnapping. But the most devastating accusation came from an unexpected source: a former CIA analyst who had become obsessed with the case. This analyst proposed a theory that John had orchestrated an elaborate cover-up to protect himself from allegations of prior sexual abuse, manipulating both Patsy and Burke while staging a kidnapping to deflect suspicion. According to this theory, John had killed JonBenet during a sexual assault that had gone too far, then convinced Patsy that Burke had accidentally killed his sister during a fight over the pineapple. The analyst suggested that John had manipulated Patsy into believing that they needed to protect Burke from prosecution, leading her to write the ransom note and participate in the cover-up. This theory seemed to explain many of the inconsistencies in the case. John's direct path to the wine cellar, his calm demeanor during the crisis, his immediate arrangements to leave Boulder, and the family's reluctance to cooperate fully with investigators. The media embraced this narrative with devastating effect. John and Patsy were tried in the court of public opinion long before any charges were filed. They were portrayed as wealthy, privileged parents who had gotten away with murder through their connections and expensive legal team. The Boulder Police Department, under intense pressure to solve the case, focused almost exclusively on the family while ignoring evidence that pointed to an outside intruder. They refused to seriously investigate other suspects, dismissed the DNA evidence as contamination, and continued building their case against John and Patsy. John's professional life crumbled under the weight of the accusations. Access Graphics, the company he had built into a billion-dollar enterprise, was sold to distance it from the scandal. His reputation was destroyed, his family was torn apart, and he found himself living under a cloud of suspicion that seemed impossible to escape. But just when it seemed like John Ramsey would be charged with his daughter's murder, science intervened in the most unexpected way, and the truth about JonBenet's killer would finally begin to emerge from decades of speculation and false accusations. In 2003, a veteran detective named Lou Smit came out of retirement to take a fresh look at the JonBenet Ramsey case. Smit had solved more than 200 homicide cases during his career, and he approached the Ramsey investigation with the methodical precision that had made him one of Colorado's most respected investigators. What Smit discovered would change everything. Instead of focusing on the family's behavior, he focused on the physical evidence, and what he found pointed overwhelmingly to an intruder rather than family involvement. The broken basement window wasn't just a random detail, it was a clear point of entry. Smit found spider webs that had been disturbed, scuff marks on the wall beneath the window, and evidence that someone had climbed through the narrow opening. The suitcase position beneath the window wasn't random either. It was perfectly placed to allow someone to climb out after committing the crime. The unidentified boot print in the basement was a size that didn't match any member of the Ramsey family or any of the friends who had been in the house that morning. The Caucasian pubic hair found on the blanket covering JonBenet's body came from an unknown male who had no legitimate reason to be in contact with the child. But most important of all was the DNA evidence. Advanced testing revealed that the unidentified male DNA found on JonBenet's clothing and body belonged to the same person, and that person was not a member of the Ramsey family. This wasn't contamination or transfer from medical personnel. It was evidence of direct contact between JonBenet and her killer. Lou Smit's investigation also revealed critical flaws in the Boulder Police Department's handling of the case. They had failed to properly secure the crime scene, they had ignored crucial evidence, and they had developed tunnel vision that prevented them from considering other suspects. The FBI became involved in the case, and their criminal profiler, John Douglas, reached the same conclusion as Lou Smit. Douglas, who had profiled some of America's most notorious serial killers, concluded that the crime was committed by an outsider with obsessive motives, not by a family member. Douglas's profile described the killer as someone who had been watching the family, who had intimate knowledge of their routines and finances, and who had planned the crime carefully. The killer was likely someone who had access to the house or who had been inside before, possibly a contractor, delivery person, or someone connected to JonBenet's pageant activities. In 2008, the Boulder District Attorney's Office finally acknowledged what the evidence had been saying all along. Based on advanced DNA testing that definitively proved the presence of an unknown male's genetic material, the Ramsey family was officially exonerated. District Attorney Mary Lacey issued a formal apology to the Ramsey family, acknowledging that they had been subjected to years of unfounded suspicion and public persecution. The DNA evidence, she stated, was powerful evidence that the crime was committed by an unknown male intruder. But the exoneration came too late for Patsy Ramsey. She had died of ovarian cancer in 2006, never living to see her family's name cleared. She had spent the last 10 years of her life under a cloud of suspicion, branded as a child killer by a media that had been too quick to judge and too slow to acknowledge the truth. The case's failures led to significant reforms in law enforcement procedures. Crime scene protocols were strengthened, forensic training was improved, and interagency cooperation was enhanced. The JonBenet Ramsey case became a textbook example of how not to handle a murder investigation. Yet, even with his name cleared, John's fight for justice was far from over. The case remained unsolved, the killer was still free, and John knew that somewhere out there was a monster who had destroyed his family and escaped justice for more than 2 decades. Today, nearly 3 decades after JonBenet's murder, John Ramsey continues his fight for justice with a determination that has only grown stronger with age. Now in his 80s, John has become a powerful advocate for victims' rights and forensic advancement, pushing for the kind of modern DNA testing that could finally identify his daughter's killer. The personal cost of this fight has been devastating. John lost his eldest daughter, Elizabeth, in a car accident in 1992, for years before JonBenet's murder. He lost his wife Patsy to cancer in 2006 while she was still under suspicion for their daughter's death. The man who once lived what seemed like a charmed life has endured losses that would break most people. But John's story isn't just about loss, it's about resilience and the pursuit of truth. In 2011, he remarried and found love again with Jan Russo, a woman who has supported his continued fight for justice. Together, they have worked to keep JonBenet's case in the public eye and to push for the advanced DNA testing that could finally solve the mystery. The technology that could identify JonBenet's killer exists today. Forensic genealogy, the same technique that solved the Golden State Killer case and hundreds of other cold cases, could be applied to the DNA evidence from JonBenet's murder. This technology can take even small amounts of degraded DNA and use it to build family trees that lead investigators to suspects. But there's a problem. The Boulder Police Department and the District Attorney's Office have been reluctant to pursue this advanced testing. They cite concerns about the age of the evidence, the cost of the testing, and the complexity of the case. John believes these are excuses, and he's fighting for legislation that would give victims' families the right to demand case reviews and advanced testing. The revelation that shocked the world isn't just about new evidence or a dramatic confession. It's about John Ramsey's unwavering belief that justice can still be served, even after nearly 30 years. His recent public statements have been more direct and forceful than ever before, calling out the authorities who he believes have failed his daughter. John has publicly stated that he believes the Boulder Police Department knows more about the case than they've revealed, and he's accused them of protecting someone or something that prevents them from pursuing the DNA testing that could solve the case. These are serious accusations from a man who has spent decades fighting for the truth.